Good morning. Same protocol, locked door, empty room. I've only got about 30 minutes, so we're going to get through at least half of chapter 5. Then I'll come back later this afternoon and finish it up. So, capturing and releasing energy. Um, Organisms that are photosynthesizers take CO2 out of the atmosphere. They lock it up into carbon atoms of organic compounds, which we talked about in chapter 4. Then those organisms, other organisms, will break down those organic compounds for energy. The CO2 then re-enters the atmosphere. That's the whole plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Animals, that oxygen breathers, put the CO2 back into the atmosphere. When you burn a forest to clear land, and you burn fossil fuels such as coal and petroleum or natural gas, that puts atmospheric carbon out of balance if you are doing it too much. There's big controversy at this time. The United States was at one time one of the biggest polluters in the world. We have been overtaken in that realm by countries like China and India. Yet it still seems, this is one person's opinion, that in the world view, it's still the United States who is the evil country when it comes to polluting, and we've done more to solve the pollution problem worldwide than any other country has. But again, when you burn coal, petroleum, and natural gas, there is no doubt that that puts excess carbon back into the atmosphere, and the only way to get that out is to have more photosynthesizers. This air pollution, smog blankets, this is China in December 2013. That's what Los Angeles, California used to look like in 1975. In the late 60s and early 70s. I don't know that LA's smog blanket was ever that bad, but LA did have a smog problem. Not so much anymore. Yeah, there's still a smog problem in LA, but nothing like it was, 45 years ago. This is an Antarctic ice core. This is somebody holding it. All those little dots you see are air bubbles. One of the ways that we know what the CO2 level was, thousands of years ago, is to take these ice cores. We know approximately how old these ice cores are, so we melt them, we collect the gas, and we measure the CO2. Right now, the level of CO2 in our atmosphere is like 0.03%, and we can, look at these, and we know that at one point in Earth's history, the CO2 level was much higher than it is right now. Yes, it's rising a little bit, and we could have the argument about global warming and global climate change and the cause of that and all of those things. Ties a different day. Take an ecology class if you want to have that debate. But just understand that the CO2 level on planet Earth has gone up and gone down throughout Earth's history. And one of the ways we know how that happens is looking at these ice cores. Energy radiating from the sun travels through space in waves. Light is kind of interesting in that it has a couple of different forms, but waves. It's organized into little packages called photons. And when we talk about photosynthesis, we will talk more about those photons and how they work. The distance between the crests of two successive waves, when you measure the wave-like action of light, the distance between the two crests, that's the top point of the wave, the distance between those is referred to as the wavelength. All kinds of different wavelengths. You have UV light in this room. There is ultraviolet, which is UV. There is infrared. There's what is called visible light. All kinds of different wavelengths. Human beings can perceive different wavelengths of light as visible light, and then we can see the various colors of visible light, the colors of the rainbow. If you were in elementary school, you remember a fellow by the name of Roy G. Biv. That's red, orange, yellow, blue, green, blue, indigo, violet. Those are the colors of the rainbow. And those are the colors that human beings can see. And then you see all those nuances of, you mix a little red with a little, blue, and you get a color, and you mix a little yellow in there, and you get a different color. But all of that is a result of wavelengths. The shortest wavelengths of light are way down here. The highest wavelengths and the longest wavelengths are over here. Visible light, now this is all different wavelengths of light. This is visible light right here. Very little bit of what is actually known as light is the light that we see. And then again, you break it down this way. If you start down here, you've got your Roy G. Biv. Photosynthetic species use pigments to harvest light from photosynthesis, an organic molecule that can absorb light at specific wavelengths. When we think about green plants, we think about the green part of the light spectrum, but plants can also absorb the red parts and the blue parts and all the kinds of different other areas. And that's what you see in a leaf. When you see leaves start to go dormant in the fall, before they turn brown and fall off the tree, they turn other colors. There's reds and yellows and golds. Those are all different pigments that are showing through. They're there all the time, but they're just not there in really high numbers. The pigment that you see most is green, therefore the leaves tend to be green. Chlorophyll A is the main photosynthetic pigment in plants, and it is in fact a green pigment. This shows all the different various pigments that occur. You see here is the green, but you also see some yellows and some reds and some golds. Here's a nice little image of the light absorption. You see chlorophyll B, again it's green. You see beta carotene, which is sort of an orange. Then I'm not going to attempt to pronounce all these other ones. Here's chlorophyll A, which is also a green color. And you see the blues and the reds, all of them, and you see their various wavelengths. Photosynthesis converts light energy into chemical bond energy. You take CO2 and water and the energy from the sun, and plants have the capability of making sugars, and then there is a byproduct, which is oxygen. Some textbooks, some equations will show it sugars plus water plus the oxygen. Others will simply have an arrow drawn that shows that the oxygen is released in these reactions. Chloroplast is the organelle of photosynthesis in plants and some protist organisms. Those protist organisms we'll talk about a little later in the semester. When I was taking these classes more years ago than I care to remember, we referred to those things as the plant-like protists. All chloroplasts have something called a thylakoid membrane. If you look at a cross-section of a chloroplast, you will see a very highly folded intermembrane system. The thylakoid membrane kind of looks like little stacks of pancakes or stacks of coins. They form a continuous compartment within the stroma. The stroma is the semi-fluid matrix found inside the chloroplast. It's between the thylakoid membrane and the two outer membranes of the chloroplast. And there is a cross-section. Picture A is a chloroplast in the leaf. That's a moss plant. And you see each one of these structures is an individual cell, and then each one of the little green dots within each cell is a chloroplast. You take one chloroplast and slice it open to expose the inside. Here's the stroma, that's the fluid in here, the little stacks of coins, those are the thylakoid membranes. And then you have the two outer membranes, and then the thylakoid membrane, which is the one that separates the stroma from the interior of the thylakoid. And then part of the thylakoid membrane with the cutaway view showing that this is all one big continuous compartment, but it's folded into all those different little coin-like structures. Photosynthesis is a two-stage process. There are what are called the light-independent reactions and the light-dependent reactions. We used to call these the light and dark reactions, and after many years, people began to realize that more than likely that was confusing, saying the dark reactions and the light reactions, because people were getting the idea that the dark reactions maybe happened at night or during the dark, and that's not true. The light reactions are the light dependent. They are dependent on light. Light has to be there for them to happen. The light independent reactions are reactions that happen, but they don't require the energy of light. What the light-independent reactions require is the products made in the light-dependent reactions. If you look at the where these reactions take place, the light-dependent reactions takes place in the thylakoid membrane. The light-independent reaction occurs in the stroma. Two stages of photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions, such as you take a product called ADP, which we talked about before and we'll talk about again. You take a product called NADP+, which is an electron carrier, has the ability to grab an electron and carry it and use it at a later stage. Then you need the water and the energy. From the light-dependent reactions, we get a product called ADP. We take ADP, add another phosphate group, and we get ATP. We take the NAD+, we add a proton to it, and it's now NADPH, and we have oxygen that has already been released, and the oxygen is released from the breakdown of water. Here's the hydrogen right here, and then the O2. So there's your H2O for water. Then we take these products, ATP, NADH. Now's where the carbon dioxide comes in, and more water. We have the light-independent reactions, which are also referred to as the Calvin-Benson cycle. And an American biochemist named Melvin Calvin spent his entire life studying these reactions, finding out what happens where in these light-independent reactions. The products removed or that come out of the light-independent reactions, we have our ADP, so we can start the process all over again. We have NADP+, the original, one of the original reactants, and now we're making sugars. Now what the plant has the ability to do is then take these sugars and convert them into other things. Some of them will be converted into starch, some of them will be converted into lipids, some of them will be converted into proteins, depending on the particular plant you're talking about. But it all comes from these two sets of reactions. The light-dependent reactions are dependent on the chlorophylls and other pigments found within the thylakoid membrane. They absorb light and pass that energy on to the photosystem. When those photosystems are excited, they release electrons. Those energized electrons leave the photosystem. They enter the electron transport chain, and then the hydrogen ion gradients drives the production of ATP. Now, one of the things we need to understand about the way light works, when light passes and hits something, it can do one of two things. It can be reflected, which means it bounces back. It can be absorbed, which means it's whatever is hitting the light soaks it up, or it can be transmitted. Transmitted means it just passes right through it. If you have glass windows in your house, the light transmits through the glass window, lights the inside of your house when the sun's out outside. My shirt is red, and I don't know whether you can tell, but it's sort of got blues and greens and other colors in it. The reason we see this spot right here on my shirt as red is because the red light, the red wavelengths of light are being reflected off of this shirt. They're hitting it and bouncing back, hits your eyes, and my shirt looks red. Other wavelengths of light are being absorbed. So when we talk about green plants and the wavelengths of light, they're actually reflecting the green light. They're absorbing the reds and the blues and the other things. And as the green pigment goes away in the fall, then the red starts to be reflected, or the yellow or whatever, and the green then is absorbed and controls photosynthesis. During the light-dependent reactions, oxygen is released. Electrons end up locked up in a product called NADPH. Might be a good idea to make a mental note, because you'll probably see a question at some point, during which stage of photosynthesis is the oxygen released? Where is it released? During the light dependent reactions. The electron transfer phosphorylation, more commonly referred to as the electron transport chain. This is where the process of energy from the electrons driving ATP formation. It's the energy. Each electron that gets picked up has the ability to convert a certain number of ADPs to ATP. Light-dependent reaction still. First step, light energy ejects electrons from a photosystem. So the light hits those electrons, excites them, and they bounce out. The photosystem then pulls in replacement electrons from water. The electron that it's pulling in is the hydrogen electron. So when it pulls the hydrogen electron, the hydrogen proton moves along with it, and that breaks the oxygen. The oxygen then moves, and that happens another place, and then the two oxygens come together. You'll remember our covalent bonds we talked about a little earlier. We break the covalent bond. This oxygen wants to form covalent bonds. Its hydrogen's been taken away. This one wants to do that. Then those two oxygens come together and form a covalent bond. If you don't remember that, check back to your PowerPoints on chapter 2, and that will show you where those covalent bonds or those electron sharing bonds are. The electrons then enter the electron transport chain, which is found within the thylakoid membrane, and the electron energy is used to form hydrogen ion gradients across the thylakoid membrane. In other words, it makes a hydrogen ion gradient where the hydrogens want to diffuse. Remember, diffusion things wants to go down a concentration gradient. So that once that gradient is formed, those ions, those hydrogens start to flow down the gradient. Another photosystem will receive the electrons from the electron transport chain. Okay, I'm still connected. I thought I got bumped off. Electrons then move through a second electron transport chain where the NADPH is formed. The hydrogen ions flow across the thylakoid membrane through the ATP system. And finally, the ATP gets formed within the stroma of the chloroplast. This is a nice little artist's rendition of everything I just said. Here's the light energy meeting the water. The electrons are transferred, and there's the light energy. There's number 3. We're moving along. Here's the electron transport chain. You see how it steps down in energy. Then it goes back up. It stepped down in energy again, and now we get our NADPH. We then get the ATP formed. The ATP then goes out into the stroma, and that's where the light independent reactions are going to happen. So the light independent reactions, also known as the Calvin-Benson cycle, these reactions do not, again, require light, but they do require the products made in the light-dependent reactions. This is a cyclical carbon-fixing pathway that forms sugars from CO2, takes the carbon, and remember, the organic molecules that are going to make sugars are made up of primarily carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And this is where the carbon's going to come from. The carbon in the sugars is coming from the carbon dioxide. The oxygen and the hydrogens that make up those sugars are going to be coming from the water. During the process called carbon fixation, that's where the carbon from inorganic sources such as CO2 gets incorporated into an organic molecule. A simple organic molecule would be something like glucose, C6H12O6. That is a simple glucose molecule. That's one molecule of glucose. In most plants, the enzyme rubisco is responsible for fixing carbon and attaching CO2 to this intermediate structure. Don't worry, I will never ask you what that intermediate structure is. Just understand that there will probably be a question that says, in most plants, what is the enzyme responsible for carbon fixation? The answer, rubisco. Here's a picture of the Calvin-Benson cycle. This is the inside. This is the outside margin of an individual thylakoid membrane. Here's the ATP that was formed. Here's the Calvin-Benson cycle, and ultimately the sugars being formed. and those exit the chloroplast and go to wherever they are needed by the plant. Plants have certain adaptations. We all know that there are plants that thrive in desert environments. There are plants that thrive in moist environments. And they do that by differing the way, primarily leaf structure. There are some other things as well. But one of the things that plants have done over evolutionary history is plants that live in areas where water is of great concern often have a very waxy buildup on their leaves. They have what is called a waterproof cuticle. The cuticle is made up of wax, and that helps prevent the plant from losing excess water. On the underside of a plant, there are structures called stomata. These are pores in the plant. The plant has the ability to open and close those stomata. They're gaps found between two guard cells on the plant surface. These stomata allow gas exchange through the cuticles. This is where the CO2 comes in and the oxygen goes out. It's also where water vapor comes from. If you'll remember back from a previous chapter, we talked about the water cycle and how water vapor exits plants. It's through the stomata that's happening. Now, 3 different types of photosynthesis. There are what are called C3 plants. C3 plants use only the Calvin-Benson cycle to fix carbon. They conserve water by closing their stomata during the day, on dry days. Oxygen interferes with sugar production. So what happens in these plants during hot, dry parts of the year, C3 plants don't grow a lot. Their growth is somewhat slowed, because what's happening is during the hot part of the day, when there's light available, they close their stomata because they don't want to lose any excess water, and that buildup of oxygen will start to disrupt sugar production. So they're sort of stunted in their growth during the hot, dry parts of the summer. Sugar production becomes less efficient as the daytime temperature rises. That's why plants grow very, very well. In Arkansas, certain plants grow very, very well in the spring and up into about midsummer, and then starting toward late summer, they stop growing. If you think about, if you're a gardener, you know there's certain plants that you want them to produce and you want to be able to eat the stuff from your garden, you have to plant them early because they have a long growing season. And if you don't get them in the ground early enough, then they can't grow enough by the amount of time they've got. Then it gets to be on up into late July and August. It's too hot, the plants stop growing. There is a picture of the cross section of a leaf, and each one of these little bean-like looking structures you see all over the place, those are the stomata. What you actually see here are what are called the guard cells. The structure, the stomata itself, is the hole between the two guard cells. You've got one guard cell here, another guard cell right beside it, and they can actually open like this, let the air and the gases and things in and out, and then during the hot part of the day, they come back together and close. An alternative light-independent reaction that minimizes the binding of oxygen to rubisco in some types of plants, there's actually 2 of these. Most of the plants that we have around here are C3 plants. However, there are some C4 plants. C4 plants minimize photorespiration by fixing carbon twice. And they do it in 2 different cell types. And we may or may not talk about those, but understand that C4, it's a less efficient way of doing things. And then there are plants called CAM plants. CAM is an acronym for a word about this long. Never ask you to say it, never ask you to spell it, not going to ask you to remember it. All you need to remember is CAM or CAM plants. These plants conserve water by fixing carbon twice at different times of the day. These are plants that actually do some of their processes at night. On the left, that is some type of a grass. That would be a C4 plant. Corn, for instance, is an example of a C4 plant. The CAM plant, this is some kind of a succulent. I'm not real sure what that is. But again, these, cactuses, some of the cacti are CAM plants. Earth's early atmosphere had very little oxygen, very little oxygen gas. There was lots of oxygen on the planet. There just wasn't a lot of oxygen gas. Most of the oxygen was bound up in other things. Ancient organisms extracted energy and carbon from molecules such as methane and hydrogen sulfide. That's that whole extremophile thing, if you remember the archaea organisms and their extremophiles. But once photosynthesis evolved, oxygen began to build up in the environment, and it accumulated in the oceans, and it accumulated in the atmosphere. And by accumulating in the ocean, I'm talking about dissolved oxygen, not the oxygen that makes up the water. I'm going to stop right here. I've got a meeting in a few minutes, so I'm going to stop here, and we will pick up with oxygen and the atmosphere in just a few minutes as soon as my meeting gets over.